Hi, my name is Ian Jacobs. I lead the payments standardization activities at the World Wide Web Consortium, and I would like to thank you for inviting me and my colleague Davor from Adyen to speak to you today about secure payment confirmation. I last spoke with you about SPC a year ago in November at the Authenticate conference. I introduced this new API for web checkout and described our goal as streamlining checkout and fulfilling regulatory requirements for strong customer authentication and transaction confirmation. I'll also use the phrase dynamic linking, which I believe is the phrase used under the PSD2 European regulation. And what I described last November was an experiment that Stripe was about to initiate with SPC to test a hypothesis. Their hypothesis was that the FIDO authentication experience through SPC would be superior to the traditional step up of a 3D secure payment, which was one-time passcodes. And so Stripe thought users would like it better, and they ran their experiment for a few months, and in March then they reported the findings. Most notably, conversions went up by 8% using SPC compared to one-time passcodes, and authentication was also faster, about 3 times faster using SPC over one-time passcodes. In both cases, SPC and one-time passcodes, and I imagine any strong customer authentication flow, there was negligible fraud. So that was all very encouraging. There was a better user experience, more conversions, and negligible fraud. That really triggered a growth in interest in this API, and we developed a lot of momentum at that point. So in the second and third quarters of the year, the Web Payments Working Group, continued to flesh out our use cases and requirements documentation. The Chrome team in parallel wrote an explainer for SPC, sort of from a developer perspective, looking at use cases and the rationale for working on this API. This work then culminated in the publication of a first public working draft for SPC in August. So what that means is now the Web Payments Working Group has taken this on as a formal deliverable and will be continuing to develop it and seek interoperable implementations in the W3C process into next year. At the same time, based on the Stripe experience, Chrome began to make some changes in their implementation, and now they are planning to ship a version of the implementation that is reflected in the specification this month. So it will be available on Windows and Mac OS in Chrome 95. In parallel, and in fact today, EMVCo published version 2.3 of their 3D Secure specification. That specification includes support for secure payment confirmation. So this is a great signal of industry interest in the API. The reason that we need an integration into an underlying protocol is that there's communication back and forth between the merchant site and the bank or whoever the relying party is to get information about what instrument the user has enrolled with their credentials, and then to return FIDO assertions back to the relying party for validation. So we rely on an underlying protocol for those communications, and 3D Secure is the first sort of formal integration. We're also sort of in the remainder of the year looking forward to results from a pilot run by Adyen and Airbnb, so Davor will be speaking more about that in a moment. And then Stripe is also anticipating a second experiment later this year, and so we're looking forward to the results from both of those. Based on all of this, our vision for the key capabilities enabled by SPC can be summed up as sort of 3 superpowers. The first is a browser-native user experience for payment confirmation, so that is what is shown on this slide. When the API is called, there's a modal window that pops up, and the user, having enrolled previously, can authenticate, and in doing so, the browser hands transaction information to the authenticator, so that is shown on the dialog, the store name, the payment information, and the total. That's sent to the authenticator, it's signed, and that signed information is returned in the resulting assertion, and that is what's going to allow the relying party to validate that the user has in fact seen this information, and then the browser and authenticator combination has signed it. Another interesting feature of SPC compared to vanilla FIDO is that in ordinary web authentication and FIDO, a relying party is the only party that can authenticate the user. In SPC, we decouple who can conduct the authentication ceremony from the who can validate the assertions, and so that is a distinction from vanilla WebAuthn. The second is web authentication level 2 does not allow for cross-origin registration, and SPC does. And there are ongoing conversations between the Web Authentication Working Group and the Web Payments Working Group and the FIDO community more broadly about these capabilities, some of which in the future might migrate into web authentication, but today these are the distinguishing characteristics of SPC. How does SPC fit into the authentication models, such as those described in the PSD2 ecosystem? So, as I mentioned a moment ago, SPC offers this possibility of decoupling the authentication ceremony from validation. And in some sense, this is sort of what all the parties would like. The merchants would like to have maximum control over the user experience on their site and not send users to other origins, for example, to redirects or to their apps. At the same time, in a world where the issuing bank, for example, cares most about the validity of the assertion, they still have the power to validate the assertion. And so SPC occupies this unique position in this matrix where it allows the merchant to conduct the authentication and the bank to validate it. But SPC can also be used in other authentication scenarios, including delegated authentication. And so that, I think, is what the Adyen experiment showed. Adyen was the relying party, and they were also validating the assertion. And so this flexibility means that we imagine SPC could be used in a variety of payments ecosystems and different setups. And over time, that landscape might change, but it is not constrained to be used in any single particular way. Coming up, as I said, we're looking forward to results from at least 2 more experiments. This is a natural part of the W3C standardization process, and the API will continue to evolve based on implementation experience and developer feedback. At W3C, we're always interested in sort of broad interoperability among browsers, and so we're continuing our discussions with other browser vendors than Chrome to try to get SPC supported natively as well. We also are interested in integration in other protocols. So EMVCO has had discussions already with us about what SPC in secure remote commerce might look like. We continue to have lots of conversations with other parties about open banking APIs and how SPC might fit in there. We've had some conversations with proprietary wallet providers about how SPC might be useful to them. And so I think the more opportunities there are to leverage SPC, the more valuable the API will become, and the better the user experiences will be across these different payment types. As part of the W3C process, we gain implementation experience and show, as I said, interop, and so we'll be building a test suite. And in particular, and perhaps uniquely at W3C, we recognize that there's a lot of discussion about compliance with PSD2. Our test suite may be finely tuned to help parties who are interested in compliance questions answer questions about whether software can be trusted to their specifications and so forth. And in general, we're trying to help with accompanying documentation to build confidence in the ecosystem that SPC can be used to fulfill PSD2 requirements. So that's ongoing work, but it's an important part of ensuring the success of the API. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Davor. Thank you again for inviting us to the conference, and have a great rest of conference.
Hi, everyone. My name is Davor. I'm a software engineer in Adyen, and I work in the authentication team. The main goal of our team is to provide a unified and reliable authentication solution for our customers. And as part of that, we aim to reduce the shopper drop-off rate as much as possible. As part of our experience, we worked with we worked with strong customer authentication protocols, for example, 3DS. And we have faced a lot of different challenges. One of the main challenge is the shopper abandonment, which is caused by the current challenge flow offered to the end consumer by 3DS. This is the main reason why we decided to integrate SPC in order to minimize this shopper abandonment. Our SPC integration includes both a redirect option and an iframe implementation, which depends completely on the wish of the merchant. Throughout our SPC journey, we faced several challenges, and we had to go through several changes in our implementation. For one, the enrollment flow was previously standardized by the browser. That changed for it to be owned by the relying party, which can be, for example, Adyen, which on one hand allows for more customization and flexibility, but also on the other hand, needs more responsibility from the relying party themselves. Secondly, the tracking of enrollment proved to be difficult, especially when it comes to the same instrument on multiple devices. This caused for us to change our implementation from greedily attempting authentication on each transaction that's eligible for SPC to relying on a cookie set on the user's browser. And the main reason why we did this is to try to avoid seeing the SPC, the newly added SPC screen, which appears when authentication is performed by a website with credentials that are not valid for that shopper. Of course, relying on a cookie comes with its own challenges. For example, the shopper can delete their browser data and therefore cause problems with this implementation. But for now, this is the best solution that we could come up with. Related to this is differentiating whether a user canceled SPC authentication or if they're not enrolled. This also proved to be a challenge and caused some difficulty because the response code of the SPC error was made more generic. So we could not determine why there was an SPC authentication error. We circumvent this with the same process as the previous issue by setting a cookie and relying on its value to know what the shopper actually did during the authentication process. Lastly, we had to tweak our integration to allow for a more graceful 3DS fallback in case the issuer refuses the delegation of authentication in a PSD2 regulated market. Our flow looks something like this. The shopper comes on an Adyen on a page that hosts the Adyen enrollment UI, and they can see their payment instrument along with an explanation of the fact that they can check out faster next time using, in this case, Touch ID on Mac. Once they press Use Touch ID, they're prompted with a browser native pop-up, which asks them to verify their identity on adyen.com in this case, which is the relying party. Once they perform a fingerprint identification on their device, they're prompted with the verification screen, which explains that next time they use this device and this payment method, they can use Touch ID in order to check out. Despite the challenges that we had with SPC, we very much enjoyed working with W3C and the different parties involved in the whole SPC implementation. We are impatiently waiting for the results of our demos, and we are hopeful that SPC will bring lower drop-off rates and improve the overall shopper experience.
Thanks, Davor, for sharing more information about the pilot. I'd like to thank you all again for inviting us to the conference, and I hope the rest of it goes well for you. Thanks.